Hi there, my name is Riley Phelan, and I did my project on the Tanzimat reform. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the reforms, and hopefully I can teach you something that you didn't know. So we'll start off with a little bit of background. The Ottoman Empire is where the Tanzimat reform took place. So this is a picture from 1830, which is 9 years before the reforms were officially set in place. So this kind of will give you an idea of the area we're working with here. Most historians will agree that Sultan Selim III was actually like the godfather of the Tanzimat reforms themselves. He didn't actually put them into effect. He actually came into power in 1789, and his reign lasted until 1807. And then the date that the reforms were officially set into place was November 3rd of 1839 in the Hat-I Serif Decree. So a little bit more about the Sultan here. He is succeeded by his uncle Abdulhamid the First. I hope I said that right. And again, that was in 1789, and he went till 1807. And the Sultan, he actually did some great things. He had really great ideas that were pretty modern for the time, actually. So one of the things he did was set up a committee of reformers, and this was sort of like the start of the reforms. It kind of was the main idea behind the reforms themselves. And then he also had like a lot of military reforms, which is apparent in the reforms that were set into place like 50 years after he actually took power. And Selim, he set in the Nizami Sadid, or the New Order, which was another set of regulations which came along with the Committee of Reformers. And some of the things that they did were governmentships, taxation, and land tenure, along with the military reforms. And shockingly, he flipped his ideas after France invaded Egypt and then left Egypt about 5 years afterwards. He really liked what Napoleon was doing in Europe, even though he attacked his people. If you remember in the picture earlier, it showed that the Ottoman Empire did actually go into parts of northern Africa. And Selim was actually in alliance with Great Britain and Russia during this time. So he went against them as well, which did not make them too happy. So they actually imprisoned him. And then when another person was trying to come to power, they were trying to put him back into place, but they didn't realize that he had been hung by the eventual successor's orders. And that brings us to the reforms that actually happened, and they promised 4 aspects of life, and those were that they guaranteed the security of life along with honor and property to Ottoman subjects, declared equality between Muslim and non-Muslims, and they wanted to establish a regular system of taxation and to abolish the tax farming system, along with establishing a well-functioning system for their military service, because as we learned in class, their military was being picked from the same areas over and over again, and that made it so that those regions were not as well off as other ones. And then certain families were being punished compared to more families. They did not fulfill all their promises. The last 2 were actually never fully put into place, which is why the Tanzimat reforms were never fully implemented, and that is why a lot of historians or people would just say that the reforms failed because they never truly were put into place. This brings me to the influences that the reforms themselves had, and they had on people. As you can see, I do have Middle Easterners up there. And some of the influences were in laws, politics, architecture, and then Middle Easterners. There were secular ideas that were being shown and accepted throughout different types of laws and in the political world as well, which was a very modern thing for the time. They have been pretty set in their ways on religion, especially. and to see secular elements, especially in places in architecture like churches and government buildings. That was a very big step for them. Positions of power were also being taken a lot more seriously by the people now. They were getting sick and tired of being corrupted, or their government officials being corrupted for so long by Western countries. And again, like I said, buildings were being constructed with secular ideas. Some places included Mardin and Kosovo that I looked at in my actual project. And then Bedouins and the Young Turkish Party and Malcolm were three very big sources for me for politics. And they kind of explained more on what like the government was trying to do with the reforms with the people actually. And Middle Easterners, this would be my biggest influence. I would say that this is actually my entire argument behind my paper, is that the Middle Easterners themselves were modernized during the reforms, that the reforms didn't actually modernize the region, they modernized the people. And then this brings me to some of the laws. One of the laws was the Land Code of 1858 and the Building Law of 1882. The Land Code of 1858, isn't that important of a law. It was just one of the first ones that I ended up finding after the reforms were set into place. And that law just stated that the individual is, or the abstract individual is a legal subject, not anything else. And then the Building Law of 1882 is actually a pretty big law for the time for them. Not that it had anything special in it, it was just that every building law was then based off of that one afterwards. And then the Nizami courts, like we learned in class, the Cody's courts, I hope I said that one right, they were I guess you could say the religious courts that were in power at the time. And then when the Nizami courts were put into effect, it showed a more secular court, so it included more people. And it was kind of showing that the staple of the society was moving from religion and to allegiance to the state. And then I put mass schooling in there, even though it wasn't necessarily like a law. It was sort of a norm that was taken more seriously at the time, and it showed kind of the people modernizing into new times to get educated for everyone. And then the Young Turkish Party would be what we're going to talk about next here, along with the Bedouins and Mirza Malcolm. And the Young Turkish Party, they in the 1860s were not happy with the current sultan that was in power, so they decided to protest against him. And this was one of the main points that I used in my paper actually, was that due to this party here, it showed the modernization within the people, because they started to protest, which I think is a very modern thing to do. The Bedouins, what the government was trying to do with the Bedouins that I related to politics was they were trying to basically rehabilitate them into society. At one point, they were basically just nomadic, still are. There are still Bedouins that live today, but there are nomadic tribes, so they don't really stay in one spot, and they don't have to pay taxes and stuff like that. They were thought of as criminals at the time because they were thieves. So the government, I guess you could say, was trying to rehabilitate them into society so that they could progress as humans instead of regressing, because they thought of them as the most primitive human that you could be. And Mirza Malcolm was a big political satirist at the time, and he was a writer and was writing about the struggles that the Middle Easterners were facing because of their government officials. And one of the pieces that he was writing on actually was looked at by a prince, and he actually responded to him, and Malcolm basically tears that prince a new one because he kind of calls him out, calls him a hypocrite, because the prince says that he wants change, but in reality doesn't want anything to happen, because if something were to happen, he would lose all the outside funding from Western civilizations. And then Mira Pasa was the first governor, kind of after the reforms were set in place, that actually like cared about the people. And it kind of showed because they were actually in a state of modernization during the time. And it just kind of showed that once the people actually agreed with someone and they were actually being looked out for, that their civilization was actually growing and progressing instead of just staying the same and then having a bunch of turmoil afterwards, as we've had to see now. So next is the architecture that happened during the time. Like I said earlier, Mardin and Kosovo are two examples. In those cities, there was a lot of buildings that were being created, and a lot of, especially churches that were being redone, and new ones being made as well. During my research, I found a lot of Christianity that was being kind of reinstated during the time, also Judaism, and they were building, more religious buildings that included more people than, just the majority, but they included everybody. And then they even showed a lot of Western architectural ideas, I guess you could say, within their government buildings and their religious buildings, just with like the structures that they were using, the material, and kind of like the designs that they were making. And this kind of really showed that in all aspects of their life, they were kind of getting these modern ideas. One of my sources, I can't remember off the top of my head which one it was, but they are quoted as saying that with these modern ideas, this is why those architectures, or that architecture has lasted so long and looks the best, I guess they could say, out of all of them. I don't know, I'm not an architecture expert. That's just what they're quoted as saying. And then my final slide here is about my paper. So my thesis is that the reforms modernized the people of the Middle East, not the Middle East itself, not the region. And then a challenge that I had was that, like, most of my classmates have done a clear group or a person, and the Tanzimat is, more of, that was just kind of what the reform was called, but it was more of like an idea that happened, or I guess you could say like a political group that just kind of spanned, like decades upon decades. So I guess that was kind of a challenge for me. My most interesting fact was that when I was looking at this source here, some social events and Tab of the Tanzimat period, I learned that in the court cases that they were looking at, that it was considered an ordinary crime referring to murder. So I thought that was very interesting, to think that that was like so common back then that they just called it ordinary. Yeah, so that's my presentation. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something new. Thank you.